I just want to say, if you've never been to the Fisher Museum at Harvard to see those dioramas, they're really interesting because depending on how much you're following the talk about forestry and forests in Massachusetts, it gives you a nice big perspective and a long perspective. So as Robin said, my name's Maria. I work at the DCR Les Terry Quabbin Visitor Center. So we're open 6 days a week. We're closed Wednesdays, but we're open 8:30 to 4:30 every other day. If you happen to take a trip down to Belchertown, you can visit us. And I'm here today as part of this cool exhibit that is here in Athol about rural life in the United States, and to talk about the Quabbin Reservoir and very specifically about how the valley was cleared to create this reservoir. Obviously, if you're from Athol, if you've lived here for a while, the reservoir is a huge part of this region of Massachusetts. What happened and what it is now has a huge imprint on this part of Massachusetts. So it's called Clearing the Valley. I do work for the DCR. If you didn't know our full name, it's the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I work in the Division of Water Supply Protection. So DCR also manages the state forests and parks in Massachusetts. My division is responsible for the water supply for primarily, it goes to Greater Boston, but we manage the Quabbin, the Wachusett, and the Sudbury reservoirs along with the Ware River watershed. And we're responsible for managing the watershed land and also the source waters, and we work in conjunction with the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, which is responsible for treating the water and distributing it to homes. If you've never seen a map of the water system, make sure I know it, oh, there we go. So it's always good when I do my presentations to give people a little background and sort of context for the whole water supply. So the metropolitan water system consists of Quabbin and Wachusett. Those are the two active reservoirs. Sudbury Reservoir is emergency backup. The Ware River watershed area is supplemental. And altogether, these reservoirs provide the drinking water for 43% of the state. So that's actually over 3 million people get their drinking water from here. Much of it does travel from Quabbin through the big aqueduct deep underground to Wachusett Reservoir, to a treatment plant here in Northborough, and then on into the Greater Boston area where they have huge holding tanks. The treated water are held in these big concrete tanks before it goes on to people's houses. Maybe about 20 years ago, they started replacing the open reservoirs in the Boston area with these concrete covered tanks, because if you think about it, you've treated your water, and then you're going to go put it back in an open reservoir. The potential for contamination went back up. So keeping it in the big concrete tanks helps keep it clean. But there is, and a lot of people are not aware of this, there is actually a second aqueduct called the Chicopee Valley Aqueduct, which was added in 1950. It has its own treatment plant right here at the south end of the reservoir, and it takes water down to Ludlow, to one of those big concrete tanks. And then it serves Chicopee, Wilbraham, and South Hadley Fire District number 1. So altogether, 200 million gallons of water a day is used, which seems like a lot. However, what's considered the safe yield of the system is 300 million gallons a day. So it is well under what's considered the safe yield of this water system. But we're here more to talk about the actual construction and clearing of the valley. I will talk a little bit about the Ware River watershed. Ware River watershed area was developed in conjunction with the Quabbin, but mainly we're going to talk about the Quabbin Reservoir and the Quabbin Valley. If you've never seen this photograph before, it's a photograph from prior to the reservoir being built from the Enfield Lookout area. So from what they call Big Quabbin Hill, you can see the notation on the photograph. And it's probably one, if you've visited Quabbin at all, you've seen, but that's not that view. You've probably seen this one. So obviously very different. And I often mention this when I do programs for schools, that if you don't know the story of the Quabbin, if you just happen to come upon it somehow, you know, it comes across as, wow, this beautiful natural area. But it's important to remember this was completely constructed. We went from a valley with 4 towns to a reservoir full of water surrounded by forest. A little bit of history about the system. Actually, it kind of ties into this whole rural history exhibit you're having. Like a lot of major cities, Boston, starting in the 19th century, started to build water supply reservoirs away from the city itself, looking for clean water away from their city. And they started in the 1840s with Lake Contituate, which is in Framingham. The Sudbury reservoirs were built in the 1870s, between 1874 and 1894, and they actually built 7 separate reservoirs on the Sudbury River. And then in 1890, they went out to the south branch of the Nashua River, where they built the Wachusett Reservoir. So Wachusett Reservoir was by far the biggest one. It actually, when it was built, it was one of the largest in the country. It holds 64 billion gallons of water when it was built. But when they were building the Wachusett Reservoir, there actually was a report written by the Massachusetts Board of Health. So the Massachusetts Board of Health actually oversaw the metropolitan water system. And they were projecting into the future and thinking about the growth of the metropolitan area and where would they get enough drinking water for the population they were projecting. So they looked at a lot of different watersheds around the greater Boston area, but by far their favorite was the area of the Ware River Valley and the Swift River, or sometimes known as the Quabbin Valley. So this map is actually from that report in 1895. And at that point, they had suggested building a small reservoir in the Ware River, and then, of course, this major reservoir in the Swift River Valley. If you've ever seen a map of the Quabbin, this is from 1895. This is what they estimated this reservoir would look like. They were extremely accurate in their estimation. The report, if you ever read it, and it's actually available online, the Internet Archive, if you are interested in reading it, they describe the area, they talk about the watershed of the Ware River, you know, that it contains a very small population and the factories upon it are very small. So those towns were not very big. They're probably all of them maybe less than 2,000 people. And from the point of view of the populace in the Boston area, it was an area that was available for their use. This is actually, this is West Rutland, which is one of the villages that was taken. So for the Ware River watershed, ultimately 23,000 acres was taken. And they took land, Cold Springs is a village in Oakham, West Rutland Village, and village in Barry called White Valley. And then they also took pieces of Hubbardston as well. And the Ware River watershed, although originally in the 1895 they did talk about building a reservoir there, flooding an area there. Nothing was flooded in the Ware River. What they did was they took that 23,000 acres around an area of the Ware River. Then they built this structure, which you may have seen before. It's called Shaft 12. It's right on Route 122. Shaft 8. It's right on Route 122. And this is where it's the Ware River intake works. So it's where actually they can divert water from the Ware River into the Quabbin or to the Wachusett, depending on what they wanted to do. And it was named after the longtime supervisor, so it's officially known as the Roger Lonergan Intake Works. So in that 1895, they also talk about the Swift River Valley, and they love that. The engineers love that valley, and they describe it as that it's the river is made up of 3 branches, which if you were unaware, the Swift River still has 3 branches that flow into the reservoir. So you have the west branch, the middle branch, if anyone's ever fished at gate 31, that's the middle branch, comes in there. And then over here at gate 40, when you come in at gate 40, you're actually walking over the east branch. So these 3 branches came together down here at the south end in Enfield and exited the valley, and then eventually the Swift River flowed down to the Chicopee River. So what they liked about it was they liked that had this very high quality water, very clean, but that the topography of the valley, which really appealed to them. So all this low-lying areas surrounded by natural hills, so it kind of made what they considered almost a natural reservoir if they just closed off the valley at the south end. So this is actually a map from 1922, which is when the proposal to build the reservoir was officially written. It shows the brown lines show the town roads. The dark blue shows you the water that was there. And then the dark blue lines is the Swift River. And then the light blue is, again, the estimation of the engineers where the area would flood. And then the outline of that blue is actually the Swift River watershed. So ultimately, what was flooded was 25,000 acres of land, but they did take another 56,000 acres because the goal was to create a water supply that was protected by the land surrounding it. And just to point out, this is our modern map. If you think back at the map I just showed you, again, the engineers' accuracy was pretty amazing. And remember, this is all pre-computer. They're using slide rules, paper, pencils in their brains. So the Quabbin Reservoir, when it is full, holds 412 billion gallons of water. So there were 4 towns in the valley itself: Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. And those are the 4 towns that would be completely disestablished. There were actually 7 other towns that surround the reservoir today that were impacted by the building of the reservoir. They lost land to it, although they were not officially disestablished the way these 4 towns were. So we tend to talk a lot about these 4 towns, but important to remember that other towns were impacted as well. And just, this is Dana, Greenwich, Prescott, and Enfield. Enfield was the largest of the 4 of them, but altogether there was only about 2,500 people that lived in the valley in the 1920s when this project took place. The Ware River watershed displaced about 300 people when they took that land. So the Swift River project began in 1927. This is one of the series of aerial photographs that they took before they began the project, so as to have a view of what the valley looked like. Here is actually the Swift River right here, and the Windsor Dam was built just about in that location. The area was known by the name Quabbin interchangeably with Swift River Valley, and the word Quabbin actually was used, the area was known as Quabbin for thousands of years. It is a word from the Nipmuc, and it means something like place or meeting of many waters. So the valley had streams and ponds, and so it would have been a very important hunting and fishing area for the Nipmuc. In 1932, the state legislature voted to name the new reservoir the Quabbin Reservoir. Just to give you an idea, the project took about, the clearing part of the project took about 11 years. It started in 1927. It was completed, the construction and clearing was completed in the summer of 1939. And then 7 years later, the reservoir was full in 1946. But this is a photograph that was taken on a completely other project in 1938. And here is the Windsor Dam. Here is the Swift River. And just to see how it has, basically been denuded of all vegetation before the reservoir started to flood the area. So the reservoir was built by an agency that was created with the legislation. It was called the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission. Say that 5 times fast. So they eventually staff numbered about 100 people in the valley, mostly engineers, but administrators and laborers. The state actually contracted with private companies to do the construction work of the major construction of the dam and the dike. But a lot of the work that I'm gonna be talking about was actually done by the staff of the agency, which I'm not gonna repeat the letters again. And just as just a cool picture, the engineers, they had a baseball team and they actually did play some of the towns. A lot of the engineers were relatively young, and they did eventually sort of integrate some of them with the town residents. They actually served on town boards, they sent their kids to the schools, and also played baseball. So one of the first beginnings of the project was a clearing of the cemeteries, and this is actually something that a lot of people have a lot of interest in. That actually written specifically in the legislation is a whole section, it's actually section 7, that talks about what's going to happen with the graves. In the legislation, they write all of the known graves will be removed. There would be as much effort as possible to locate living family members. to make decisions about where the graves would be removed. If there were no living family members, then the state would build a cemetery to hold those graves. Ultimately, out of 7,601 graves, known graves that were disinterred, 7,613 known graves, 6,601 were reburied at the Quabbin Park Cemetery. The Quabbin Park Cemetery was built on land in Ware, a former farm. I think it was about 33 acres that they purchased for the cemetery. They've only developed a very small portion of that. And that is where the majority of the graves were reburied. Just only a few thousand were actually reburied in different locations. So as a family member, you would have if you were the agent for those family graves, you would have the decision as to where your graves would be reburied. In some cases, people may have lived further away and they wanted to have the graves located closer to them. Some people had them buried in other cemeteries as protests. But the majority of people chose to have the bodies reburied at the Quabbin Park. So there were 34 cemeteries in total that were removed. They weren't all in the 4 towns that were disinterred. They actually were also, New Salem and Pelham had graves as well, that because they fell within the area that was going to be developed for the reservoir, those cemeteries were also removed. And this is not the greatest map. Sorry, it's a little faded, but it gives you an idea where all of the cemeteries were. And when we say, it's really important to recognize that it was all known graves. So there were graves that were not removed because they were unrecorded and unknown. They did do a very organized and meticulous job trying to locate as many graves as possible, besides just looking at the cemetery records or the church records. This is actually a report that we have in our archives. It's a report from one of the engineers that was in charge of doing the research to find the graves, and they talk about to an older resident, they talk to a former cemetery commissioner, or 2 of them actually, and the town records as well. So they did a lot of research. The other thing they did is they also wrote a lot of letters. So we do still have all the files. Each grave was given a file. And within those files, you can see the letters would be written to the person that was identified as the family agent. And a lot of times the person would come back and write back with a family tree. So the state did try very, very hard to locate living people to decide where the graves were going to go. They did go into the original cemeteries and they investigated for evidence of grave sites, because of course not every grave site is going to have a headstone. And then they also mapped them. So this particular one was in Greenwich, it was the Greenwich Cemetery. And Greenwich is actually where a lot of the oldest graves came from. And the one I want to talk about specifically was a woman who was buried in this block here, which is block 318. So her name was Sarah Cooley. She died in the 1700s. She had no family or any living agent left that could be discovered. So she was classified as an unknown, and she was given a number, U-776. And this is her gravestone, and the gravestone is located in the Quabbin Park Cemetery. They did take a photograph of all the headstones, and those actually, in the past, I want to say 3 years, have been uploaded to the Digital Commonwealth. Has anyone ever heard of the Digital Commonwealth?
Before, I've heard of it once from a DCR member last year.
Okay, so the Digital Commonwealth, if you are someone who likes history and likes historical images, you got to check it out. It's actually run by the Boston Public Library, and they have a mass of amazing stuff, and you could just go down a rabbit hole and spend 8 hours looking at it. But the Metropolitan District Commission, Metropolitan Water Supply Commission photographs are actually housed there, the real estate ones, the cemetery ones, and within the next year, many of the construction ones will be up there as well. So it's a great spot to do a little research or just sort of explore. Anyway, so this is Sarah Cooley's gravestone. She was classified as unknown. And this is the record that they did. So they drew a map of the cemetery, and this is actually the record where they went through and they listed all of the lots, and they listed the people that were buried in those lots. They talked about the condition of the headstones. They wrote down the transcriptions as well. Sarah Cooley's is on there. And so she was number 51 in lot 318. Her headstone was made of fieldstone, and they classed it as poor condition, although other than it's hard to read because of age, it's still standing. It looks pretty good. So, but one of the fortunate things is they did write down all the inscriptions, so that makes it helpful if people are trying to research genealogy. So in memory of Mrs. Sarah, late consort of Mr. Reuben Cooley, who died, June 1784, at 24 years of age. And it also tells you the size of the headstone. So there's a series of cemetery books, and eventually that information will also be online. At this point, we do have a lot of our cemetery records that have been housed on our website. One of our GIS staff has been working on it very diligently for several years. And that can be found if you just Google Quabbin Park Cemetery. You'll get the graves viewer, and that has a lot of information on it. But I wanted to point out again, so this is an unknown grave. She's classified as unknown. She doesn't have any living relatives. This is some of the records that we have, again, in the archives. And this is the daily list of graves that were classified and removed on one particular day in this block 4. And over here, so Sarah is U-776, and it says what cemetery she was in, what lot she was in, what block she was in, and how many they removed 4 bodies, and it actually has the date. So this was the daily report that was submitted to the, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with that, daily report that was submitted to the engineer in charge of the project. And then over here this was written before it was typed, officially written up, and here is the handwritten notes. One of the interesting individuals from the valley, and he died many years before the reservoir was built, but JR has actually written his life, right, in one of your books, Ace of Snow, also known as Popcorn Snow. He was a character, and the story about him is that, like a lot of people in the 19th century, he was afraid of being buried alive. So in his will, he asked to be buried above ground in a glass-topped coffin. And his family cemetery was in Petersham. So it was one of those pieces of land that was taken that wasn't, the whole town wasn't taken. And it was actually right inside where Gate 40 is. That was the Snow family cemetery. But this is the photograph they took when they were preparing to remove his grave. And it tells you the marble slab is cemented to the tomb, and it was fair, the marble is fair, and it lists also him and also 2 of his children and his first wife. He was reburied in the Quabbin Park Cemetery, but he was buried underground, and he has a new headstone. To open this vault, they would have, unfortunately, I think, they would have damaged the headstone, and so he was given a new one. He had a living family when he was reburied, so that was a choice they must have made. There were special coffins that were built to hold the remains. And there's a lot of actually gruesome stories that were printed in newspapers at the time talking about, what they found and how the state wouldn't let them take photographs. And also even today, there's a lot of sort of rumors around the people that had the job, the laborers who had the job. And one of them is that they got paid more and they had to live in quarantine while they were doing it. And there actually is an article from one of the Springfield papers where they interviewed the engineer who was in charge of it when they were writing an article about removing the cemeteries. And, when he was interviewed and he was asked this question about, is it a dangerous job and do they have to live in quarantine? He laughed and said it's just a regular laborer's job. They did hire a local undertaker. He was actually from Enfield, and he was responsible for transporting the bodies. And so that was actually a comfort to a lot of people to have one of their neighbors helping them deal with this particular process. So the Quabbin Park Cemetery, at the entrance, it has 2 stone columns. The columns were built with stones from all of the cemeteries, and on the right-hand column, there's a list of all of the cemeteries that were removed. So the removal of the cemeteries probably was one of the first things that they started to do. But not far long after that is when they started to assess real estate and started to purchase land from people. A lot of times there's some confusion because we do refer to it as the land being taken. But if you were a landowner, you were paid for your land. And most people actually sold up willingly, not willingly, but didn't wait till the bitter end. There were a few people that did, few families that waited. But majority of people just, they knew what was coming, so they chose to sell their land. You were paid both for the land and for the buildings on your land separately. And they were paid market rate. Unfortunately, most of this took place in the Great Depression, and land values were depressed. So certainly a hard thing for the families that had to leave the valley. So this is Enfield just prior to the dismantling of the town. And it was a process that homeowners went through, business owners. This is actually a photograph of a business that was in Enfield. It was a car dealership and an automotive garage. It was owned by a man named Thomas Sanderson. The way that it would work is the engineers would come and they would sketch in little notebooks, the properties that they were looking at. And this is actually from the notebooks, their sketches. So the field notes of the survey of his neighborhood. Homeowners could submit a property blank, and I have a picture of that a little further on, and they could tell the state, this is what I think my property is valued. These are the improvements I did on it. This is why I think it's valued this much. Or you could wait for the engineers to be done with the valuation and let you know. They took a picture again of every structure. In all the pictures, there are these slates down that are included in the picture, and it has a lot of information on it. And these real estate pictures are also on the Digital Commonwealth, and if you zoom in, you'll see the slate picture. And what the information tells you is up here is the number of the map. So there are something like 400 real estate maps, and this tells you that Sanderson's property is drawn on real estate map 268. His picture, his photograph of his property is 1381. It tells you his name, it tells you what town, it tells you what day they took the picture, so sometime in late April in 1930. It gives you a rough layout of where it was. They don't use the actual names for the towns. It tends to be more like to Greenwich, or in this case they call it the Belchertown Highway. They also show you the placement of the camera, where the camera was, and then where the property, the buildings were on the property. So they would actually draw the footprint of the house, and a lot of the houses would have been long and narrow with an L, but the garages or barns were just squares with X's in them, so you knew what they were. So actually go back real quickly. Thomas Sanderson was paid for his property, was paid for his so the land, the buildings. He also received loss of business. So he asked $30,000. He was given $21,000. He took that money and he moved to Ware, and he actually opened an auto dealership in Ware, which is where he lived the rest of his life. So the farmers didn't seem to get loss of business. They didn't seem to evaluate, how much land went into working a farm. But this particular family, it was actually 3 siblings. So it was a woman and 2 brothers. And they lived in Prescott, and their name was Wendemith. And I always choose them to talk about because after they were bought out, they actually moved to the town I live in now, which is North Brookfield. And they had a farm in North Brookfield for many years. And probably about 10 to 15 years ago, their farm, their pasture was, the town voted to conserve it. And that's actually part of the East Quabbin Land Trust. So it's kind of neat, and some older residents remembered the brothers' work in the farm. So this is their house, this is their land. They had about 200 acres, and they actually had 2 separate properties. They had a cousin who owned a small acreage near them, and they asked for, I think it was $18,000, and they got $15,000. So this is just a detail of the real estate map. So currently the real estate maps aren't available to the public. You could certainly reach out to the visitor center, and we can give you a copy if you know exactly what you're looking for. Eventually, they should be online as well. But this shows you So here they are. Ruth was the sister, and Albert, and I forget the other brother's name. Albert actually, and the brother actually, they both served in World War I, and their names are on the plaque down at the Quabbin Park Cemetery. So this is their property, and it tells you, you know, how many acres was arable, how much of it was woodland, and also it should on here somewhere show their, might not be able to find their house, but here's someone's house. There's the house, and there's 2 barns and behind it. And so, of course, these were also, we had the field notes you saw from Thomas Sanderson, so they were brought back to the headquarters, not just at Quabbin, actually, but also in Boston. There were engineers worked on, and they would be transcribed onto blueprints and then copies made of those blueprints. So they're actually pretty big maps. They're about this big. And then, of course, there were other types of businesses. This particular man, his name was William Walker. He lived in Greenwich. He actually owned a lot of different businesses. This is just one of them. This was the Walker store. It was the sort of the general store that was in Greenwich Village. And for that he received, sorry, I don't have it on my notes there. I can't see it. For that one, he received about $7,000 for the building. So it was the store, and then he also had another store that was in the building that he rented out to someone else. But he also owned the water rights to a mill, and so for the water rights, he actually got like $21,000. And altogether, ultimately, for his property, he received probably close to $50,000 for all the property that he owned in Greenwich. And this is an example of the property blank that he filled out for the store. And it's a little hard to read, I know, but it tells you what was there, and it tells you the improvements that he did on it and what he thinks it was worth. So one of the more interesting stories of homeowners, or not homeowners, but property owners in the valley is the Dugmar Golf Course. So the Dugmar Golf Course, many of you may have heard the story. And it actually was built by 2 men from Springfield. So they were CEOs of a company in Springfield, Thomas Marr and John Duggan. So they bought 147 acres of land in Greenwich for $6,750 in 1925. And they developed a 9-hole golf course and built this really nice clubhouse. It is interesting that they bought the land at such a point, 1925. 1922 is when the reservoir was first put before the legislature. There was several years of back and forth. So when people say, oh, well, were they speculating? Seems fairly likely that they were. It also, though, they wanted to, have a clubhouse. It was during Prohibition, and this is oftentimes what certain classes of people did, where they would create a club and then they would be able to drink there with their friends. But they did a good job with their golf course. They hired a renowned designer, and they have their scoring card, and there's some interviews in our oral history of young men who served from Greenwich that served as caddies, and a little bit about the stories about how they were carousing and drinking up there while they played golf. So it was designed by a man named Orrin Clark, who, if you understand anything about golf courses, which I really don't, but this was explained to me by somebody who does, Orrin Clark was an apprentice of Douglas Ross, who was one of the early well-known golf course designers in the United States. So for the land that they bought, so it was 147 acres that they developed, and they did hire, a very well-established golf course designer. They asked for $3,600. Sorry, I can never do this. 360,000, right? $360,000. There we go. I'm sorry. They actually took the state to court, and there was a lawsuit. They ended up getting $179,000, which honestly, they did pretty good. Maybe not what they expected to get, but. So the clubhouse was left. It was made of stone, so it wasn't removed. Buildings that were not made of stone, that's why mostly its foundations are all that's left. Everything else was removed. But this clubhouse is on what is known as Curtis Hill, or Curtis Island. And these pictures were taken, so we have a program now where we, to keep track of the gulls on the reservoir, we have Mass Highway fly drones over the reservoir, and they capture some great photographs for us like this one here. So one of the really sort of intriguing parts of this whole clearing the valley is the story of the buildings themselves. So some people did actually not sell their buildings to the state. They chose to move their houses with them. This was the Thayer House. And you can see it actually, and at that time and in the 19th century, it actually was not that unusual to move houses. They weren't attached to foundations. And so some people did move them. In some cases, they would like move them by truck, which is what they did with this one. You can see it's on a flatbed truck. They took off the roof and the porch was there, and they drove it out of town. That was pretty unusual. Most people, they would take the boards apart and then move it that way. But most people didn't do this. This was more expensive. Most people just sold their property and their houses and went and bought new houses and new property. But the state, in the interest of trying to remove things as simply as possible, once they purchased buildings from homeowners or business owners, they then turned around and sold them very inexpensively just for materials, to get the stuff out of the valley. And there was a lot of interest in a lot of these homes. This shows you one that's being taken apart, and it's a lot of times the materials were used to build new things. So in our region, there are a lot of buildings that are probably built of materials that came from Quabbin, particularly things like barns and chicken sheds and pig pens, because it was the Depression. It was material that was really cheap. You were looking to build a new barn, you go and you buy this material from the state in the valley. But there was a lot of interest in some of the historic buildings, historic houses, and we have some research. Unfortunately, the connections or the information was lost at some point. So we have some information. We don't have everything, which is disappointing. But I know, for instance, that there were some houses from Prescott that antique dealers actually purchased for people in Wayland. So Wayland is a community right closer to Boston. It's right near Wellesley and Dover. And there are houses in Wayland that were rebuilt using materials of houses from the 1700s from Prescott, because it's actually on the historic register for New York City. It was moved to Staten Island. It looks actually pretty much the same. So this was one of the ones that was built board for board. It was rebuilt exactly as it was. And I just think that's really cool. There were other buildings we've had people come to tell us, like there was a woman in Greenwich, Connecticut, who actually purchased 3 buildings and built a very nice estate down in Greenwich, Connecticut. That sort of information we have. We have a lot of oral history. In some cases, we've been able to track down buildings. This was a building from Prescott, and it essentially was kind of moved down the road to Pelham. And unfortunately, the farmer that bought it used it as a chicken shed for a long time. So the people that own it now, although they would love, it's a secondary building on their property, and although they would love to fix it up, if you look at the condition of it, this picture was taken almost 10 years ago. So, unfortunately, not in good shape. But as I said, a lot of the civic buildings, things like churches and in some cases schools, we do know where they were removed to. Joseph Skinner, who was president of Mount Holyoke at the time, he actually moved several buildings to the Mount Holyoke campus. They are part of the Skinner Museum, and they house his artifacts. And this was a church in Prescott. And when it was moved to Mount Holyoke, they added the steeple on top that didn't have it originally. And there's also a schoolhouse, as well as one other building as part of the Skinner Museum. Down in Storyton Village, which if you've never been there, it's at the Big E Fairgrounds. In Storyton Village actually for me has another interesting connection, which it's named for a woman named Helen Osborne Storrow. She was married to James Storrow. And anyone ever driven on Storrow Drive? Okay, so Storrow Drive was named for James Storrow. James Storrow was very involved in community voting. They were a very well-to-do Brahmin family in the Boston area, and they devoted a lot of their time and energy to helping the less fortunate in the West End. And Helen Storrow was really interested when the MDC, which is the same agency that used to manage the Quabbin, was building the Esplanade or modernized the Esplanade, and she donated money towards it. And she stipulated, I don't want any roads when you build it. She died, and after she died, they built Store Drive in the 50s. So, so that's just kind of a fun story because I used to work there along the Charles River, and then when I came out here and started learning this stuff, it was like, oh, this is really neat. You know, she had an influence in other parts of the state. So Storeton Village is made up, of historic buildings, and one of them is the Atkinson Tavern, which was in Prescott, so the Atkinson Hollow. And it was brought down to Storeton Village, and they actually have a plaque outside the building. It's still a restaurant, and they have a plaque outside the building telling the story of where it came from. And then one other building, which I thought was interesting, and whenever I do a program in Palmer at one of the schools, I always like to point this out, which is this was another church. This one was in Enfield. And it was purchased by, at the time, in the 30s, by the Palmer Grange. And I don't have to explain what the Grange is, right? Everybody knows what the Grange is? Okay. I am going to say this. The Grange was, it's an agricultural club, and they allowed women as full members right from the beginning. So if you weren't aware of that, okay, important thing to know about the Grange. Anyway, so it was the Palmer Grange building for many years, and then they sold it fairly recently, within the last 10 years, to the Amherst Railway Club. So it's a hobby rail club, and that's where they are now. It's right on Main Street in Palmer. So houses are being removed. People are taking the buildings away. There was another man in the area who had a construction business. His name was William Gass. He lived in Amherst. And he had his construction company was the Yankee Construction Company, and he basically built his company by using materials from the Quabbin, and he built houses around the Amherst and Greenfield area. So all that's going on, but at the same time, the state is also starting to clear trees. In the summer of 1936 and 1937, there was a program created by the governor at the time. This is Governor Curley, and he wanted to create something that was similar to sort of a cross between the WPA and the CCC. So the WPA and the CCC were federal programs, the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Civilian Conservation Corps in particular was aimed at young, unmarried, unemployed young men. So it was basically to give them employment as a way, to help their families, but also to keep them out of trouble. And you're probably familiar with the CCC. They did amazing work in our national parks and our state parks all over the country. So Curley had something in mind, something similar in mind, where he created a program for young unemployed men to go and work out at the Quabbin Valley and to do a lot of the clearing of the trees. The biggest thing that people say is that they all came from East Boston. That's actually not true, although I'd say a fair number of them did come from urban areas. And the locals called them the woodpeckers because they were unfamiliar with the material, the tools that you need to actually cut down trees. So they were known as the woodpeckers. But these are just some photographs of them from a newspaper story. And they did not give them housing. The CCC actually created housing for them. They actually would be housed. They had to find housing for themselves. And as you can imagine, you have groups of young men. They had a bad reputation, a lot of drinking and carousing. And I have read one story where this one kid who grew up in Dana remembers a car of them driving by really, really fast, going up one of the really dangerous roads, hanging out the windows, and then coming back, and one of the people in the car was dead because his arm was cut off. So pretty alarming, some of the stories that happened about them. So as we get into the mid-30s and later 30s, this is when you really start to see photographs of essentially the valley being destroyed. It's being just, and people did live there until 1938. Fewer and fewer people lived there. You had to leave by August of 1938. But some people hung on to the bitter end. And basically what you saw is your towns being dismantled. You saw buildings being removed, families moving away. And then some of the major construction that's starting to go on and obliterate things. So this is another one of those aerial photographs. This shows Greenwich Village. So Greenwich Village was nestled right at the foot of Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the biggest island in the reservoir and is was one of the larger hills in the valley. And so this is part of the map, a detail of a map of Greenwich Village. And here is the tip of Mount Zion. So this mixed picture shows you the construction of what we call the Baffle Dam. So there's Mount Zion. This would have been Greenwich Village. So there's a few houses left, but this dam was built right across basically where Greenwich Village was. The Baffle Dam was constructed because when they divert water from the Ware River, it is of a lower water quality than the water that's in the Quabbin. So their goal was to push that water to the north. So when it enters the Quabbin, it enters on the north end of the Baffle Dam. The water is pushed to the north. The aqueduct that takes the water out is actually to the south of the Baffle Dam. So it takes about 5 years for that Ware River water to circulate and end up down at the south end where that aqueduct is. And it's very close to Gate 43, which if you've ever been fishing there. The dam and the dike were the major construction that created the reservoir. Sometimes it's a little confusing for people. What filled the reservoir with water? Those two structures caused the Swift River to back up and flood the valley. So this is a photograph of the dam. They are very similar structures. The dike is a little bit smaller. They're both earthen dams, and they had to excavate down to bedrock, and they built the core walls of the dam and the dike on bedrock and then covered them with hydraulic soil. Much of the soil actually came from the valley. So when they started the project, they actually diverted the Swift River using a cofferdam. So this engineer is actually standing in the dry riverbed. At the same period, the state of Massachusetts was sued by the state of Connecticut, and Connecticut ultimately won the suit. And the suit was that by damming the Swift River, Massachusetts was taking water away from the greater Connecticut River watershed, which would impact Connecticut as well, because the Swift River goes into the Chicopee, which goes into the Connecticut. Connecticut won that suit. So as a result of that, when they constructed the Windsor Dam, they also had to construct an intake tunnel where water from the reservoir would flow south into the bed of and continue the Swift River. So south of the dam, the Swift River exists only because we release water into it, because of that lawsuit from the state of Connecticut. We are required by law from that lawsuit to release at least 20 million gallons a day into the Swift River. They do try to mimic the historic natural flows of the river, so in springtime they'll release more. And then there are other times, when they release more because there's not excess water, but whatever, the reservoir is close to full, so they'll release more. And there's actually two. This is the original intake tunnel where they built when they diverted the Swift River when they're building the dam, and then just up above it is actually the current one. So that's how much the water has filled up. And you can't see the tunnel. You can just see the opening of the tunnel right there. If you've ever walked on the Windsor Dam, you see that little building at the beginning of it. If you walk across to the west side, close to the visitor center, that little building there is actually the Chicopee. Well, it's the Swift River intake building, and also eventually that's where the Chicopee Valley Aqueduct. They constructed the aqueduct starting from the intake. Not exactly. The aqueduct connects to that intake as well. And this is it under construction. So the Windsor Dam was constructed, and the Goodnoe Dike were constructed with roads across the top, and it's nearly completed in this photograph, so this is like late 1939. You can see the upstream side looks really similar, but the downstream side, there's actually still buildings there because the water hasn't risen yet. And the reason they included the roads and also the road that goes through Quabbin Park is there was a lot of interest in watching this project. And so people would go to the place where they always had the viewpoint from the top of Quabbin Hill, and so they decided to include this as a scenic road and a scenic area. The Windsor Dam also includes a spillway, and that's what makes it different than the Goodnoe Dike. The Goodnoe dikes are different than dams. Dams have an outlet for water. Dikes are just a wall. So the Windsor Dam, and this is a photograph of it with the spillway under construction. So here's the spillway. The spillway is active when the reservoir is full. So when it reaches a certain elevation, water will spill over the wall and go into the Swift River. So it creates that pretty waterfall. And the reason why it's not active all the time, that waterfall, is because the reservoir is not active all the time. The reservoir isn't full all the time, excuse me. So this is another photograph of Enfield. In the background is the town hall, but just to sort of give you the the list of numbers, and this actually includes some of Ware River. So including the Ware River families that were displaced, there were 2,800 people. About 1,400 structures were moved or removed. 240 miles of highway abandoned, 31 miles of railway abandoned, or removed, not abandoned, sorry. 34 cemeteries, 7,613 grave sites relocated, and ultimately, including the Ware River, 103,443 acres of land were purchased. So this is one of the neat things is to see the photographs that they took as the reservoir started to fill. So the construction was done in 1939, and that is when the Swift River started to back up and flood the valley. This photograph is from 1942, so it's actually right in front of our administration building where the visitor center is housed. And if you've ever been down there, you've probably seen this view, but this is what it looked like in 1942. So those of us that work in the building, we have a view straight north up the reservoir, and you can see weather coming down the reservoir. Clouds, rain, snow. And what's interesting is the photographers that worked, in the early days for the agency, they took pictures of the same ones we do with the clouds and the different weather, the storms coming down the reservoir. So, I have to say one of the things I find most interesting about this is actually the way that this valley was transformed. Like I said earlier on, if you don't know the story, it looks like this incredible natural area. But it is sort of the power of the human mind that, came up with this, that looked at this little valley of, with a river and some towns and said, oh, that's going to make a great reservoir. So this is a photograph of Enfield prior to the reservoir. And here we have Enfield again at the end of the project, that city town hall's last one there. And then this is what we see today when we look out at the reservoir. So the forest that was planted after the reservoir was built to protect the watershed, or the water, and to protect the watershed land. So they really did transform that valley. And a little bit about the watershed land. So the Quabbin and the Ware River watershed areas, they were created, it was built that way to provide natural protection to the drinking water supply. So a lot of drinking water supplies go through filtration and then go to treatment plants. In our case, our water supply is considered unfiltered, or our foresters like to say forest filtered. So we don't have a filtration plant. It goes from the reservoirs to the treatment plant where it is treated mainly with ozone or UV light. And everything we do is really focused on that watershed protection. I'm guessing most of you know what a watershed is, but just a little reminder, it's the area of land that surrounds a body of water. It could be a lake or river or stream. In our case, it's a reservoir. And it sheds water into that body of water. So the land is pretty important. We do all live in watersheds, but obviously drinking water supplies are we're going to have a higher level of concern for the water supply, or excuse me, the water quality. And watershed protection actually is one of the best ways to protect water. And our water system is actually, people would like to emulate it all over the country. Unfortunately, land is much more expensive now. When they did this, it actually came in under budget because they did it during the Depression. So land was cheap, labor was cheap. But that's one of the big reasons why we restrict what kind of activities we allow on the watershed land, because it is protecting the water. So hiking, biking, and some fishing is mainly what we allow. And one of the sort of cool side effects that I will guarantee the engineers did not think about at all was that they created a really great habitat for wildlife. And if you go and visit the Fisher Museum, which I encourage you all to do, you'll see how in the 1930s, much of this area of Massachusetts was farmland, pasture. There wasn't a lot of woodland. So consequently, because that started when the English settlers started to come, the clearing of forests, we had lost a lot of woodland animals. And the creation of the Quabbin Reservoir, along with the return of forests in other parts of our state as well, we have seen the return of a lot of woodland animals because of Quabbin. So we have moose. Quabbin and Wachusett have half of the nesting population of common loons in Massachusetts. Wild turkey, of course, have if you were unaware, there's actually a record from 1851 of when the last wild turkey was shot in Massachusetts. They were reintroduced to Massachusetts in the 60s, and they have done remarkably well. There's like 50,000 of them statewide. Bear, of course, living in this part of the state, we are very familiar with the black bear, and it will be interesting to see what happens because the black bear are starting to move into the more populated areas of our state. And then, of course, the bald eagle, which has a great story. Bald eagles were reintroduced to Massachusetts at the Quabbin Reservoir, highly successful, and at this point, I believe there's 80 active nests in Massachusetts. And I have to say, it's one of the things I enjoy a lot. When I do these programs for kids, I will tell them the story of the bald eagle, and when I ask them if they've seen a bald eagle, almost all of them raise their hand. And I know, speaking to a room full of adults, if I said to you, did you see a bald eagle when you were 10? Anybody? Right. So the fact that, 8 and 10-year-olds are seeing bald eagles just when they, look out the window over the the Connecticut River in Springfield is a pretty amazing story. So I love to tell that story. So we strive in the visitor center to talk about the two Quabbins, the one that was there. We don't want to forget what was there. We don't want to forget what those people lost. And this is another great postcard of one of the towns. This is Greenwich. But of course, it is a really, not only a vital resource to Massachusetts, close to 50% of the state get their drinking water from here, but it is a beautiful natural area. Because of the way we manage it, there is a lot less human impact, and so we can enjoy it in a different way than we might on other natural areas. So if you're interested, we do on our website have more programs and events coming up. If you have one of those little QR codes, you can scan it. It'll bring you right to our website. If you want to write down this really long web address, you can do that. You can also just Google Quabbin Reservoir events, and it should come to it. Or you could email us at the Quabbin Visitor Center, and we can add you to our email list. So we try to do programs once or twice a month. Sometime in the winter, they're generally indoors or remote, although we do actually do hiking programs in the winter as well. And then we also are available to do presentations for libraries and other private clubs and things like that. So does anyone have any questions or comments? Or yes?
What was that digital address to find the history?
Oh, it's called the Digital Commonwealth. Digital Commonwealth. So if you're looking specifically for Quabbin Reservoir stuff, I would Google or search Quabbin Reservoir Digital Commonwealth, and it'll come right up to that. If you go to Digital Commonwealth, you can search, you could search Athol and see what, I'm sure Athol Historical Society has worked with the Boston Public Library, or I would imagine, and there's a lot of great historic visual materials on there, so it's really cool. Yes?
It was great to hear that the business owners were compensated, because previously I was under the impression that they were not.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things. Obviously, it was not their choice, and certainly, I suppose if it was a private sale, they might have negotiated more. But they were compensated for loss of business, yes.
Not all of them. Some of them, especially near the end, they got lawyers and they got more compensation. Some of the smaller ones, particularly in the late 20s and the early 30s, got nothing.
So I don't know when you say they got nothing. They were paid for their property.
Right, but they didn't get anything for loss of business or trade, as opposed to many later did.
Well, thanks for coming. If you have any other questions or you want to come up to me, before you leave, feel free. I'll be here for a few minutes. Thank you.